In fact, today, and this is a bit of a side point, colonialism has not really ended. We imagine that the days of Western imperialism and Western colonialism is ended. Our countries are now independent, as we call it. But in reality, this is a complete illusion. In fact, we have entered into a stage which has, or which can be termed as Neo Colonialism. Neo Colonialism. The West still controls most of the countries in the world, economically, politically, and militarily. The only difference is that we do not find British troops and British governors sitting in the position of rulership. But in reality, we find that most of the countries in the world do the bidding of the West. Their economic system is according to the way that America and the Western world wants it to be. Affairs, political affairs, military affairs, economic affairs are run according to the way that the West wants it to be. And this has largely been achieved through the use of economic control, through the system of riba or the system of interest or usury. You see, the Western world, being a secular, materialistic society, having ruled over many of these nations, implanted in the people a desire for the luxuries and the goods that are available in the Western world. We could call it, in fact, the Coca-Cola culture. Consumerism, nice cars, television, satellite, music, Hollywood, air conditioning, Coca-Cola. So they have created within the people a desire for these things. However, most of the countries of the world, the third world, what they call the third world, are extremely poor. How much is Afghani money worth? How much is Nigerian money worth? How much is the money of Rwanda worth? How much is Ethiopian money worth? How much of that money do you need in order to buy some product of the West? In order for these countries to gain these things, they need solid, what we could call solid cash. Dollars, Deutschmarks, pounds, yen. So what the Western world did is say, well, we will supply you with these things, but what you need to do is you need to provide us with hard currency. And in order to do that, you should grow and sell to us cash crops, things that we want, things that we like coffee, sugar, cash crops. So what happened is these countries began to convert much of the land that they used to grow food from, the most fertile land. This land was now used for growing cash crops in order to acquire currency so that these countries could procure Western goods, amongst them weapons, of course. However, the Western world was telling all of the third world countries to do the same thing. So of course the markets began to be flooded with coffee, sugar, cash crops. And the rules of supply and demand dictate that the more there is of a substance, the less money you pay for it. And the less there is of a substance, the more you will be ready to pay for it. If there's something you want it, and there's very little of it, you'll pay a lot of money to get it. But if there's plenty of it, you can name your price. Of course, you have all these third world countries producing these cash crops in abundance. So the Western world, us living in the West, we get these goods for next to nothing. However, what is taking place in the third world countries is that the land they used to use for growing food is now used for growing cash crops, but the money they are getting for selling it is very little. And what happens and what begins to take place is starvation. Because the land that people used to use for growing crops, they now use to grow sugar and cocoa and coffee and so on and so forth. So the people are not able anymore to feed themselves. So what happens? Starvation. Famine. Then the West says, well, we have mountains of grain, mountains of sugar, mountains of milk. As we know, in America and in Europe, they have huge surpluses of food. They say, we will sell you what we have to help you keep away from starvation. But they say, but we're poor, we don't have any money. Don't worry, we will lend you money. We will lend you money at such and such interest rate. So they lend them money from which they can buy back from the West, those cash crops. And what you now find is these poor countries start going into debt. In fact, what happens is a relationship between them and the West of complete dependence. Because as you can imagine, it gets more, the circle becomes more and more and more of a vicious circle. The dependence becomes greater and greater because they cannot pay back the loans. So they have to borrow more money, plus the interest, which means they are more and more in debt, until the debt is so huge there is no possibility ever of paying it off. They depend completely on loans from the IMF. So these third world countries are in reality completely under the control of Western powers. Completely under the control of the IMF, which is nothing except in reality a tool of United States foreign policy. This is Neo Colonialism. It is much more effective, much more brutal in reality than the former type of colonialism. There is not even the benevolence of maybe former colonies. And all the errors and the misguidance and the wars, and it's blamed on what? Those governments of those poor countries, not blamed on the United States. So this is how the West continues to control the rest of the world. The Western world has almost complete economic, military, and even political, even we could say ideological, almost ideological control over the world.